I want to welcome you to worship today, and as will become part of our ritual now, I also want to welcome those out in social media land who are watching with us. Not right now necessarily, but over the course of the weeks and months that follow this particular service. We're excited, and we recognize here at Shepherd that our reach as a congregation is not just what happens in this room, but what happens over Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and all the other social media that we use in order to bring the message of a good Father out into our world. And so I just want to look at the camera and say, welcome. I also want to say that we are in the midst of a generosity journey. Our worship series for this month of November, in which we celebrate the American holiday of Thanksgiving, is a series focused on how we respond with gratefulness for all the things that God has put into our lives. And so in our first week, we learned about the fact of generosity, the calling for us to be generous as God has been generous to us in manifold ways, so many ways, but then also for us to increase in the qualities of generosity that especially Scripture seems to highlight for us in 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9 and elsewhere, the qualities of intentionality, sacrifice, and joy. In other words, it's not the quantity of our generosity that is of utmost importance to God. It's the quality of the hearts that give whatever we end up giving to others and out into the world. It's those qualities that God values and we as a congregation want to value as well. Today we focus on the value of sacrifice. And the big idea for today is simply this: a sacrifice, a true sacrifice, will always pinch. Now that's a statement that's pretty straightforward, but it's a statement that in some ways is so bland that I doubt you're going to remember it. So I want to help you today to remember it in a way that you may say, Pastor Seidler, this illustration really wasn't working for us. Just buckle yourselves in and deal with it. Okay, here we go. Ready? So back when I was a young man, I was exceptionally tiny. I'm not saying I was this tall, but I wasn't really far from it. And because I liked to eat sugar all the time, we had this place called Straightway Dairy in Morris, Illinois. And my mom and dad would give me, a couple quarters or whatnot, and my friend Butch and I, that's a true name, by the way, his name is Butch. Well, it was really Clark, but he would call him Butch. Anyways, it doesn't matter. Anyways, we go down to Straightway Dairy, typically multiple times a day, and we would buy ice cream or candy or whatnot. And as a result of that, I was not a good dental patient. I had quite a few cavities as a kid. And that means trips to Dr. Tibbetts' office. Dr. Tibbetts was the dentist in Morris, Illinois. And Wilma, his wife, was the school nurse. Now, Wilma was great. She was a walking hug. Dr. Tibbett, however, was walking Novocaine. And so as a result of that, when I would go into his office, now again, just to review, I'm this big, and we would go into his office with the turquoise blue chairs of the late 1970s. You remember? It was green. And so these were holdovers from the 1960s. Anyways, and we would go in there, and he would have, his utensils out right by the chair. And you'd go in, and the first thing you would see is the needle that he was going to use on me, right? Deep and wide, deep. Scott is dead, Scott is dead. And so you would see the needles that were there, and it was like walking into a death chamber. And so anyways, bad visual. Anyways, so we would go in there, and Dr. Tibbett, this is back when, we were kind of still post-World War II. This is a rural economy that I was growing up in. Everybody's kind of just aggressive, and, there was not a lot of here, let me give you a hug kind of thing going on. And so you go in for the dentist, and he's like, you got cavities, you sugary goofball, and now you're going to have to pay the price. Okay. And so I'd get in the chair, and he would, clank, clank, clank the stuff on there, and boom, right on in. And I'd go stiff as a board, because, it was not gentle. It was building character in Scotty Seidler. And there's that. And what I loved was he would always say, now this is going to pinch a little bit. Yeah, do you think? I'm like rigid right now, and because of it. Now fast forward 40 years. Dr. Eric Emery is his name. I'll give you his contact information after I give him this plug in my sermon. Dr. Eric Emery in Baldwin, Missouri, is our dentist. So I go in, and Dr. Emery comes in, and it's just lovely. It's like Pottery Barn, dental office. And you go and you sit in this very comfortable chair, and everything is, there's wood cabinets, there's nothing out at all. There's a monitor. And Dr. Emery comes in. Well, hello, Scott, how are you? I'm doing great, Dr. Emery. How are you today? Doing great. How's your golf game today? Well, it's going well, we're through the wear. How are you children? Hey, I saw Connor. He's really growing up, isn't he? I'm like, are you on the clock here? Am I getting charged per minute? Because can we move this thing along? And, and then he'd look in, he'd continue on the conversation for about another 20 to 30 minutes. And then, that was a joke. And then he would say, now I'm going to take this Q-tip and I'm going to numb your mouth, the inside of your mouth. I said, oh, okay. Sounds nice. He says, do you want to feel the Q-tip? Yeah, I do. Oh, it's a Q-tip. And, he'd switch it around in there with some numbing agent and whatnot. And then, 5 minutes later, he'd come back in and he says, is it good and numb? And he'd put a, forceps or whatever in there and he'd, start moving around and, yeah, it's kind of numb. And then he'd start talking again about my life, my future, what I was doing with my estate planning. I mean, all kinds of random stuff. And all of a sudden, the nurse, this is where it gets really odd. The nurse would come up over his shoulder and brush up kind of against him in an awkwardly odd way, professionally speaking. And he would put his hand behind his back. And then he would come over the top of my head, and I wouldn't even see it coming because I'm looking up, and he'd say, now this is going to pinch a little bit, and then he would grab my cheek. Have you had this experience? And he'd go, and I go, and then I'd get my Novocaine, and I'm like, oh, you are good. Now, I want you, that's a lot of investment for this point, okay? Generosity is going to pinch. We're done with the sermon. Let's just go out and drink coffee. No. So that's a long way of getting to this. I want you to keep those two, Dr. Tibbet and Dr. Emery. Dr. Tibbet, by the way, in case he might be listening, Beyond the Grave, I loved you. You were great. Your wife was fabulous in school. But all of this to say, I want you to keep those two images and maybe the wincing that was happening in your own soul as you thought about your own dental experiences through the years. One guy at 8 o'clock came out and said, Novocaine? You had Novocaine? I had ether. I go, ether? I saw that on Little House on the Prairie. Who does ether? That's terrible. Anyways, so I want you to keep those two images here because I want now to take you to the temple. I want to take you to a temple where the Lord Jesus Christ comes with his disciples. And while he's in the temple, a stunning scene occurs in front of his very eyes. And I want to read it to you from Luke chapter 21. As Jesus looked around the temple, he saw the wealthy putting their gifts and coins, and money into the temple treasury, into the offering baskets, as worship was going on. And he also saw a very poor widow put in 2 very small copper coins. And then Jesus said, I tell you the truth, this poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people gave their gifts out of their wealth, but she out of her poverty put in all she had to live on. I want to take you into the temple today because I want you to see 2 classes of people that Jesus saw. And yes, you heard me say it correctly. This is a sermon. Are you ready for this? About class warfare. Class warfare, by the way, defined by the sight and judgment of Jesus himself. Now, on the surface, it may seem like the class warfare that is being described here is one of the rich versus the poor. That is not the case. Rather, the class warfare that is being spoken of here is one of generosity over stinginess. Jesus looks and he hears all this money clanking around in copper kettles, and he wonders, what is the consequence in the human heart for all of this money that's being offered to the Lord for his work in the temple in Jerusalem? On the one side, you had those who had means and who had resources. And believe me when I say, they were giving substantially. They were at the highest taxable rate of giving. They were giving a lot. And it was something to behold. And no doubt about it, if I put myself in the temple, I bet there was a lot of pride in what they were giving. And then all of a sudden, this woman comes up and she puts in 2 tiny little pennies. The thing is, little did any of them know in all of that offering that they were doing, little did any of them know that the Lord of the temple was standing there watching everything happen. And when he saw what was happening, he said this. He made a class analysis, not of the quantity of the gift being given, but the quality of the heart that was making the offering. And he said, here is a widow who is sociologically speaking, in terms of the social network that was Jerusalem in that day and age, she had nothing and she was never going to get anything. And here is everybody else, and nobody in particular. This mass of humanity. And the first thing to note is the sheer separation. There was only one that Jesus said yes to. Every other person in the temple was under the judgment of Jesus. That shakes me to the core. Because chances are, bluntly, there is a greater than likely chance that, had I or any of you been in that temple that day, we would not have been the one that Jesus, the Lord of the temple, was giving credit to. That should stun us. That should cause us to shudder. See, the reality is that Jesus looks at the heart, and generosity and a generosity journey is always a matter of the heart. When Renee and I first got into our generosity journey, after we were married, we graduated from seminary, we started making a paycheck. It was a conversation between Renee and I. Now, how in the world are we going to make this life that we're leading work? And we weren't talking about tithes and 10%. We were just talking about what can we give that gives us joy, that at the same time causes us to take you back into the dentist office. This is going to pinch a little bit. And we made our decisions. And over time, those decisions grew, and sometimes they decreased depending on the circumstances of our lives. And that's the way a generosity journey goes. A generosity journey is not linear and vertical. A generosity journey can be ups and downs, sides to sides. And I say all of that because the invitation today, if we're going to take a generosity journey, it's to ask the question, what are the qualities of the heart that God is looking at? Last week we talked about intentionality. Today we talk about sacrifice. And in talking about sacrifice, we talk about what was clearly at work in the life of this widow. There was clearly a pinch. A pinch that she felt in her soul as she gave, as Jesus says, from her poverty, while everyone else didn't even sniff poverty because they were giving from their wealth. It's an interesting judgment. But you know, one of the things about reading stories like this in the Bible is that you are really invested and invited to go into the story and just root around a little bit and wonder, what was the rest of the story kind of working out here? What was going on in the rest of this story? As I read this story, it occurs to me that this widow probably was in the temple. Well, not probably. She was in the temple. And so even though she had lost, essentially by losing her husband having died, having lost her husband in this life, she had lost all earthly security for her well-being. The first thing I note is that she's still in the temple. There are a lot of people who get mad at church and they're out the door because God does not bless them. This widow challenges me that when life gets tough, I need to get to church. I need to remember the Lord. Because the Lord, Scripture says, will never ever forget me. Even when I think he has forgotten me, he's not. As one of my early pastoral mentors said, when you think God is so far away, God is actually closer than your breath. He lives in you, and his Spirit never fails to give a witness for the needs that you have in a moment. You are never alone. So this widow had lost, earthly-wise, everything, but she hadn't lost God, and therefore she had not lost her faith in God. And so she shows up to the temple. I wonder, though, what week this is that she came to church. I wonder whether or not this is like week 10, and her husband died 2.5 months ago. I wonder whether or not her husband having died 2.5 months ago, whether or not the first time that she showed up and she had to give a financial offering to the temple, I wonder if at that point in time she only gave 1 penny. And now 10 weeks later, as the dust has settled and maybe life has become a little bit more predictable, she said, you know, my generosity journey can take a step forward incrementally, and now I can give a little bit more. If you had said to 24-year-old Scott, 25-year-old Scott, and 21-year-old Renee, when we first got into ministry, that we were going to be generously giving of our resources at the level that we are now, I would have said, well, I think that's a little firm. I mean, maybe, but wow. And I think that's part of the generosity journey for all of us, is that at every step that we become comfortable, God says, oh, no. Let's press a little farther into this. Let's go a little bit more. Not to my glory, to your glory, but to the greater glory of God that works generosity in us as we see his generosity. It's the generosity journey. Now, the thing about it is, too, is that as this widow goes on, she still has years ahead. And who knows where that generosity journey is going to end up. And bluntly, there are moments in life where generosity journey, in terms of quantity, takes a step back, but the quality actually increases because it's an even more intentional conversation. See, all of this sacrificial conversation is underneath the greater sacrifice of Jesus, who with intentionality came into this world, and with every step he took, from the moment he started to toddle and crawl, he was crawling his way toward the cross. He was walking his way toward the cross. He was being dragged to the cross. And he went willingly, even when his steps failed him. It's that sacrificial sense that invites us with every day to think about this generosity journey, and with the slightest pinch, thank you, Dr. Emery, and yet it's still a pinch. He can put on all the numbing topical stuff. He can jiggle my cheek and, make my brain rattle. He can do all the hocus pocus of behind the back and over the head and underneath the leg and, whatever else. I mean, he can do all of that, right? But at the end of the day, yeah, I felt that. I felt that. You hit the root. Good, we're good. Move along. Yep. But the pinch still matters. And that's what I want to invite you to do today, is to feel that pinch a little bit. And if you're in a place where you're not feeling the pinch, just to ask yourself the question, where's that pinch? I want to get away from the money for a second, the financial side of Christian generosity. I want to go to just other areas of life. And I mentioned this last week. Theologically speaking, there may be people over the next several weeks that come into your life who are, as the theologians say, bonkers, right? And they may be family or friends or other people that you rub shoulders with through this holiday season. Maybe you see at a neighborhood party and their dogs drive you wacko or something like that. And I just want you to think about this in advance now. What intentional pinch to your own well-being are you willing to absorb so that maybe you could work restoration with that person or reconciliation? We all have the folks that just kind of brush us the wrong way. And remember, the generosity journey we're talking about is one of the quality of our heart, not the quantity of our offering. And like I said earlier, next week I'm going to ask you to fill out a consecration card. And maybe just tell a little soundbite or snippet of a story of how your generosity journey is changing these days as we make our way through this month of November at Shepherd. It's a real simple question. Because I want to take those stories and I want to transcribe them. I want to pass them along so that the witness of each other in our generosity journeys individually encourages each other as a body of believers. This generosity journey is not about me. It is ultimately about God's work in you. And I'm excited to live it out. I'm excited to see how God cultivates and develops the resources of this congregation so that we can not just reach out here in Jerusalem or Scottsdale, but we can reach out into the world. Because Shepherd, I don't know if you know this, but in any given week, 200 to 500 people are watching you. They're watching the work of this church. They're listening to the preaching of this pastor, Pastor Allen. They are looking and they are taking their cues from what we do as a body of believers. And it's not just enough for me to stand up in front of you and talk for 20 minutes or so every Sunday. If we're going to really get after the generosity journey that Jesus, if he walked into this place, the Lord of this temple, took notice of, if we are going to really practice it the way the Lord wants to, it means that all of us have to be invested, not just one or two, while the mass of humanity over on the other side of the temple goes about their work unwittingly. It's about all of us intentionally committing to feeling the pinch that pulls us forward with joy to make a difference for the gospel. That's our calling here at Shepherd.